Hello there, and welcome to The Value of Everything. Okay, so feeling a little bit tired. Feeling like, because I spent 3 re-recordings of the same podcast last week, I didn't really perform to the levels I really wanted to perform at and produce as much as what I wanted to produce. So therefore, and I am not going to get the recording opportunities tomorrow, so I really want to just kick some ass and get some of this work done. Now, I had a whole list of my show notes to go through and all manner of beautiful things that I could discuss. However, I just thought, let's go a little bit more free-flowing. Let the mind go into thought experiment overdrive, even though I am feeling a little bit tired, but you never know what could happen here. I probably am really going to enjoy... It's always funny seeing somebody stare at you while you're talking on a microphone. It's always... I'm probably going to need a bit more of your participation rather than me. I'm probably going to come up with some terrible ideas, whereas you're going to probably come up with some brilliant ideas. Now, the topic of the discussion will be the undescribable. Now, having a topic like that is is a paradox in itself, because I'm trying to describe the undescribable, but it could lead us to some certain interesting places. I guess if I can describe something that's fairly undescribable or hasn't got really like a term used for. So there are certainly very complicated emotions which are out there that have got words, probably because of their prevalence, which have occurred in the past, and because there's been some kind of very valid evolutional connection to these feelings. I sort of hope we're not all just fine-tuned to the same square box of feelings, and there are a big brush of new things that are out there, and I know you can classify everything into senses of wonder and senses of despair, but I just think there's always new food to try out there, and I guess there's always new music to try out there. So I guess there's always new feelings to be put out there. So describing the undescribable. Now I've got to give you some examples now. This is where show notes have been so helpful. All right, let's go with describing. Okay, maybe this is a bit of a tricky one, but I guess when you get that instant feeling of jubilation when you listen to a song for the first time, and it sends you into a little bit of hairs going up the back of your neck, and you're like, oh my god, this sounds brilliant. And this is not an old song, but a new song. I'm not sure whether you experience this feeling, or is it me on my own. I could just be mentioning that I'm on my own and I'm insane, but do you get that feeling when you think, my god, that song just connects with me so well, that is me, boom, and you almost feel like dancing, jumping up from your seat and dancing straight away? What is that feeling? What is that immeasurable description? Is that, I guess it's happiness in some way, shape or form, but could we find a word for that? I'm not sure. I'd love people to expand on that feeling. I've got another feeling which it's a very unusual feeling. I think I've tried to describe it before. I'd love to know if anybody's experienced this one before, but it's something of like where you have something very lowly is happening in your life. Like you have no money, you have no food in your belly. Something very low and drab is happening. Yet you have some very good things at the same time. Say you're slim, or you're still quite attractive, or it's still the night time and you have a little bit of a sect of your own music. So it's sort of like, how would you describe that? There's a sort of, I would always mention this as a big relation to indie music, where parts of your life are falling apart, but yet there's something very cool in it. I'm not sure whether even cool is the words. As this is indescribable feelings, I guess this is where I'm going to struggle somewhat. But if you sort of understand where I'm coming from and this feeling and this description of, I guess it's a slight sense of freedom, because you know that you haven't got any drawbacks in your life. If you've got no money, then there's a certain amount of opportunity in your life, and if you've got good looks and a fair amount of intelligence, and you've got it in a certain area or band, and there's a certain level of connection with all the other people that are in there with you, it's an interesting feeling. And even though in the depths of despair and you're in this horrible little flat somewhere, there's something kind of nice in that feeling. And I've been there before, and I'd be interested to find out if you've been there before. I know I've tried to describe this feeling a little bit to friends as well, but I think it's to do with the music sort of sends this message out a lot as well. Maybe a fairly joyful sound to the indie track, an indie rock track. You find this a lot in British indie tracks, but yet there's the lyrics are about something quiet, something to be despaired about, something like about an addiction or a love that you cannot get. So even though that you might be trapped away in this room where you're, say, lonely, you haven't got a girlfriend, and it's Sunday, and you're tied up in this room, yet you still feel that there's something out there in this world, and there's inspiration and things like that. It's a really wonderful feeling to. I don't know what even wonderful is the feeling, because there's despair and prospects there at the same time. It's kind of interesting, an interesting feeling. Now let me come up with a new feeling. Let me just say what I'm thinking, and then be done with it. I was thinking about different states of silence and calm and quiet. So I was thinking in terms of like where your mind is literally taken away to a place where you're not even thinking. So your mind isn't even on the part of thought. It's in a certain state of trance. I guess that's a feeling which is fairly described, but it doesn't. Your mind is almost focused on nothing that is not even there. It's a very weird little place in your mind that you can be in, and there's a fairly strong sense of tiredness which just scrambles your brain to not even thinking about anything whatsoever. Is that a certain feeling that you could describe, that somebody could relate to, and is it worthy of even a word itself? It's a horrible place to be in, really. There's literally fuzzy nothingness which is going on there, but I guess a lot of people may have been there before. So reuniting with friends that you haven't seen for a long time, I guess that's fairly like a normal thing that people see every day, where you go to an airport and there's this gladness feeling that occurs straight away before you see somebody. You feel this warmth and this jubilation, and then for some weird reason, this is a very strange thing that happens to me because of the strangeness and everything else of it, and how you've got this sort of climactic feeling that you're getting to a stage of seeing somebody for the first time. You think everything's just going to explode and it's going to be amazing. Then it's just a bit like you get a hug, or you might shake a hand and you go, "You're right," and then everything drops back to a certain level of normality, as if everything was the same anyway. So it's almost like an anti-climax-ish method. I don't mean to dismay sort of that feeling that you may have seen somebody and things like that, but it's just I think there's something kind of nice at the same way, where you're just very used to and relaxed into somebody's company, that you can just start to go into the normal chit chat of day-to-day occurrences, and just beforehand you was in a state of a certain state of ecstasy, really, but then all of a sudden, boom, you're back to saying, how was your trip, was it all right, and just going into this normal little zone. I guess the feeling is the drop zone, but you don't even know it's really happening. It's just that drop zone of coming from one emotion and then going back to a certain rhythm again. Is there a word for that? I don't know, but please share. Now, what else can I describe? Let's describe stress at work. This is a great one. I've been in before, so I guess you could say that I've been in work before, in work situations where I felt like at some point I've been being almost like watched, and people are thinking of negative things about me, and there's sort of a certain amount of, I guess I'm describing paranoia here, a certain amount of things that are going to happen behind me, and maybe something's going to be found out at a certain stage where I didn't do things quite right to perfection, and this is all going to come tumbling down on me. And then nothing really happens, and then another day happens, and it's all over, and another day begins again, and really that whole entire intensity of feeling in that workplace environment was only just with me for that moment in time, and it really didn't even exist the next day anyway. What the F is that? Yeah, it's a state of paranoia. I guess the mind is playing tricks with you, and there's certain. I guess it's not. You can't sort of deny that your mind's playing tricks with you, but it's a valid feeling that it would probably need to be explored and understood as to why that feeling is happening. But I'm just going into the description terms of the feelings and whether we've got dictionary terms for this, and it's kind of interesting if you could relate to what I'm saying at the same point. Now, feelings. There is a beautiful amount of feelings. I guess when you get your ego massaged, that's a fairly strange feeling, isn't it? As your mind gets taken away with its own ego to a ridiculous state. So say if you, like, I don't know, pass an exam or you achieve something beyond other people's potential, there's this overriding egotistical thing that happens in your mind to think to yourself, oh, I am really special. And it just really, this ego obviously gets inflated in a rapid expansion before you even know it. And then you're flying on this weird cloud, which is fairly dangerous because that weird cloud is fairly temporary in the first place. And with that cloud, you may have a certain level of envy. I guess people will be crashing down in their own sort of world of thinking why they can't achieve as well as you have and things like that. It's really not a fairly pleasant thing to manage with ego. And I guess the best remedy when you do have that ego drive is to bat it down with a bit of modesty and say, well, I really could have done better. It's not really that much, and generally most people could do that, and just give yourself a couple of whacks back when your ego tries to really run with it. I guess if you've achieved things, there's no harm in basking for the glory, but in fair sportsmanship and being empathetic to other people, there isn't really much of a benefit of you going woohoo in front of everybody and doing fist pumps and everything else when something really goes fantastically right. So is there a description for that runaway ego which gets you taken away into this ever increasing world of I am so great, I'm the ruler of the world? Next, feelings. Let's talk about computers. What is that feeling, or what is the description? I guess it's an intense amount of patience and yearning and laziness at the same time, all mixed into a beautiful concoction with technology. What is that? What word would be described where you're just sitting there? And I guess I experienced this last night, where I'm sitting there waiting for this loading bar to be complete, and literally I cannot think of anything more important in my time and day than just to look at that loading bar and see it click through. And even though the actual loading bar just stops for a number of, like a ridiculously long time, maybe even 5 minutes at a certain point, but I can just see the egg timer moving along, I'm fixated in watching that loading time and just think, well, there's something more important in me just watching this loading time and watching this work being done, rather than me doing something a little bit more useful, or just maybe even just flicking over the channel to something a bit more entertaining or whatever. But just looking at the computer and just studying it and being in a state of, I guess it's another state of trance, of laziness and patience. Laziness and patience at the same time. It's something very strange. Is it patient laziness a word? I'm not sure what we're describing here, but it's a common factor. It happens to, I guess, a lot of us. I'm probably one of those weirdos that really gets into that sort of thing. I really should have utilized a lot of my time better to do better things, but yeah, I guess that's sort of thing that you have to apply with me a lot of times when you're listening to these podcasts. But hopefully I can give you a little bit of a load time and give you a grain of a good application that's give you some kind of something fun. Anyway, that's a feeling for you. Ego. I want to talk about the ego in some way. I think one of my major topics was the ego anyway. I wanted to cover the ego in a certain grasp. I guess the ego is... There's a big thing on psychology about your ego and how you have confidence in things and confidence that you do not have things. What about this one where you have, I guess it's called egotistical, but then you've got this planned way of going beyond your eagerness. So say you go and it's boastfulness, isn't it? Maybe I've already described something anyway, but so say like, for example, there's this task and you don't think you're really that good at it, but then you sort of get into a self-convincing state that you can potentially do this. Is that egotistical? I don't think so. You already knowingly know that you're not good at it, but there's a self-convincing point where your mind clicks and goes, yeah, no, I can do this. And maybe there's like a foggy war in the back of your mind going, no, you can't do this. But it's fairly interesting how there's this self-conviction and the masking. I guess we have this with lying as well. This is a lying, obviously, once to ourselves. So lying to ourselves, this happens where we have to convince ourselves. The best way of disguising a lie is to just convince yourself that is true. I think I've described something fairly common in most languages anyway, but it's an interesting concept where you go down a route of going, no, definitely didn't happen. And then get yourself to a point where you're almost scrubbing out the memory and getting yourself to a point of self-conviction that thought never happened in the first place, and you can perform the lie to such a incredible degree that you have full conviction. And I guess that's a slight part of art and acting itself, is where you can scrub out memories, shut down certain parts of the brain, and go into a full sense of another character. Interesting in those terms. Now, I want to go into another little thing where, I guess I mentioned this earlier in another podcast, but it's kind of interesting, where you look at a car. I know I'm obviously looking at cars right now, and you see the two lights, and you see a license plate, and you see make the license plate to look like a mouth or something. So there's a certain way that you start looking at things and images, and then you start to turn it into a face. So is there a certain term and phrase, which is, I'm probably finding that all these have bloody terms and phrases, but is there something where a word where you start turning everything into physical faces? And after a while, if you start studying things long enough, you can start turning a lot of things into faces. I know where you're looking at a curtain. I always got curtains and nets. I can always look over a curtain or net or a pattern on a wall, and I instantly start to recognize faces within inside that. Is there... I know that pattern recognition is part of the brain anyway, but is there a certain term for that? Is there a certain... Yes, with psychology itself, they do give you these little patterns, like this ink pattern on a page, and you've got to look at that, and it's... I don't know what they're doing if they're driving, and then convert that into some kind of image. Maybe somebody... like if you're more inclined to be in violence, you're going to say that ink image is a murder scene or something, but other people say it's a beautiful butterfly and things like that. But I guess I'm describing something that's fairly well used in psychology anyway, but yeah, it's an interesting concept. But seeing faces in things is interesting, and I guess I think there is a word for this anyway, where something manfractionize, where you turn like animals into characters and objects like that. But it's interesting how the human mind does work to create things into certain levels of conscious beings and something that we can interact with. there's a certain level where we're trying to yearn to turn everything into an interactive object where we can start discussing and talking to. So is there this really yearning in our minds just to turn everything into a face where we can start discussing and talking to somebody else? Interesting. Now, let us think. Now, I mean, when we go down the route of feelings, I know that there's certain movies. Not every single movie does it for me. Like certain movies, I'm not even really captivated and taken into. But there are certain movies out there that can create a feeling for me, and it's a weird, like there's a number of them that do that. And I guess with a movie, you have nostalgia of certain times and moments in your life which interconnect. But say one thing for me, like there's a lot of people, especially from the 80s and times maybe just a little bit before, were like 80s movies like Back to the Future or The Goonies, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. There's certain movies like that that really kick in a good feeling. I don't know whether it's just the feeling that it was all of those movies were probably rerun when I was a kid in the 90s, and they always reminded me of, like, I don't know whether it was always played on Saturdays, really good times, and like they're always good family movies during Saturdays, and that really gave me a good sense of a feeling. I don't know whether that's... I mentioned about the characters in Back to the Future and how they create an internet, like a network of really nice characters that you feel like that's an environment that you would love to live in. Obviously, Biff is a bully, but even so, the characters seem to be very warm, and I know they're very animated, but they seem to be something nice and appealing about all of that. If you liked Back to the Future, I'd recommend watching What's Eating Gilbert's Grape. And it's a totally different movie in a lot of respects, but there's still that certain element of that character which is coming out in that movie. It's an interesting feeling anyway. So there's that, and then there's very dark horror movies. Now, horror movies do give a certain amount of despair, but it's not really like I'm being in a life-threatening situation. Now, I've been in certain levels of life-threatening situations in terms of violence before, and really, when you're in a life-threatening sort of situation, it's not really about horror as such as what you're watching horror. It's more so a feeling of hyper adrenaline, a hyper amount of awareness, and very things are happening quite fast but slowly at the same time, and maybe your voice is raised, your body is tense. There's things which are occurring that everything is literally being hyper absorbed all in one space. So it's very different to you experiencing a horror movie where you're watching a horror movie, you're like, okay, what's going to happen here? How is this going to frighten me? And where is this monster going to come from? And can I picture where this is what's going to happen next? Oh my god, that's really surprised me there. It's more like a puzzle, and a surprise puzzle which is happening before your eyes, and maybe there's definitely a certain level of suspense. But where you're in a violent situation, I don't think there's really much in the way of suspense. I guess you might have that like suspense in your family home when some family members going a bit doolally or getting angry or something like that. But in terms of you being in a real physical violent situation, it's totally different to what a horror movie would provide. I guess I may be describing a little bit of a difference between a violent situation like an action film in comparison to a horror movie, but even so, I think it's quite relevant points to make. So the feeling of a horror movie is not necessarily, I would say, I know you could say, oh, well, you can be in a suspenseful situation where you're a hostage and stuff like that, and then maybe you might feel that certain sense of horror. But there is, even when you're in a hostage situation, there's a lot more different emotions which are occurring. You get the Stockholm syndrome, which is where you start to look at your kidnapper who's kidnapped you, and you start to say, well, let's be on his side. I guess all the police are really giving him a hard time. Let's just we're trying to get the same thing for my team, and they're part of the outside anyway. So there is that Stockholm syndrome which happens. It's an interesting feeling, I guess. There is obviously reasons why that Stockholm syndrome happens, but what was the area I was focusing on? Yeah, just the movies, and where the movies give us that feeling. Now, I do have... Movies do have certain meanings and ways of tapping into certain emotions, and there's certain things with lighting. I don't know why, like there's a music video called "All Is Full of Love" by Bjork. Just try it out one time. I think it's even in the late 90s, but it looks really like futuristic in those terms. But there's this light flare which happens in every angle of the camera, but it does definitely inspire a certain feeling in terms of it being highly futuristic, and yeah, just very interesting, like concepts, really thought-provoking in those respects. It's interesting how art can really push us forward with certain feelings that really would be unattainable in just our normal day-to-day lives of driving to the office and things like that. So definitely I'll move on from movies anyway and just try to go back to experiences that I feel. But if you can feel of a real movie that taps into certain emotions, I guess if it taps into emotion, I guess there's something there in you which it's tapping into, but you're not quite getting to a point of what it's describing. But yeah, if you have thoughts and suggestions of a certain movie that does give a feeling, I'll be very interested to hear about it, and I'll try and watch it if I can. Right. I don't know who've got this feeling. I get this feeling all the time. This is horrible, and I just remembered it now. If you walk through a bush, and I don't think I even had an experience anything like this. I've never had any issues with my eyes. I'm very sensitive to my eyes. I always like blink if anyone pretends to put anything towards my eyes or anything like that straight away. But say there's a bush and there's twigs and maybe all the leaves have gone off. There's nothing worse than me going underneath that bush, and even describing it now is making me feel horrible, and having that feeling or that pre-sensation that the twigs are going to start scratching my eyes. I can't think of anything worse than that sort of thing to do. And it's like you're trying to just put your hands up and keep your eyes covered while you're going through that twiggy, thorny bush with no leaves. I think that, and there's like this feeling straight on my eyes when I even feel that thing. There's a pre-sensor thing which is happening in my body before I even describe it. I guess you get that feeling sometimes. If I describe something really disgusting, it makes you want to vomit. There are probably words and descriptions for these things, but it's a very interesting feeling to describe anyway. It's a physical reaction to something that hasn't even occurred in the first place. But let's explore that feeling. It doesn't really matter too much. Now let's find another one in my pot of tricks. Is there a word for... Alright, this is going to be a little bit crazy. Say I've just seen a utility car, so maybe I'm halfway losing what I'm trying to describe anyway. But say I see a utility car. Now, when I see that utility car, I instantly have that feeling of that car's getting to work, that car's doing things, and picturing in my mind that car is a very functionable worker's man car and stuff like that. For all I know, there might be just a mother who's picking up her kids in that car. But I instantly get this sense, and I just get this association in my mind that person's off to do a job and doing what he needs to do in those terms. I guess if you see a police car, you're instantly saying, right, that person's going off to fight crime and give people speeding tickets and all that jazz. There's a certain level of association which gets applied whenever you look at anything and you go, okay, well, that's what's happening there. And I guess that's how you try and work within the realms of your reality. You have this association, you apply it, and then you think that people are off to doing those works. It's kind of interesting that obviously helps out criminals quite a lot, because once they see somebody that's dressed in a smart suit, they don't really necessarily think that you're going to be a criminal that's going to stick a gun up and rob you, but maybe with a typing on the computer and in a fraudulent manner, maybe that's possible for a criminal to do that. But When it comes to your association to things and your expectation of things, when you see a big utility car with a dirty tyre, you might think it's been going across roads, it might have been helping out at the farm. There's a number of feelings that you just get conjured up that comes into your mind even just by you looking at that thing, that's happening subconsciously before it's even been applied. Now, I feel like I'm slightly stating the obvious here, but hopefully I can walk over something that maybe we've got some kind of relation to, and there might be some grain of good or some grain of exploration of thoughts, or there's some grain of relation which is happening here, which helps. Wonder is a beautiful thing. Wonder is an amazing thing, and sense of wonders in different things can really interest us. Now, say if we was looking into the stars and space, doesn't happen that often, but when it does, there is a certain feeling. I don't seem to get this. I just get this sense of wonder. I'm like, whoa, we're in a bigger place and a bigger time than what we could ever vision ourselves to be in. Even though I have a feeling of, obviously if I logically think about this, I start to think that I'm very small, but then I start to feel that I'm fairly large. It's really weird how when you take a large picture of something and you look at it and you go, oh my god, that's amazing. Yeah, I'm seeing that I'm looking at such a vast, large area. I don't feel that inferior. I feel like I am that. I feel like I'm a Buddhist talking here, but is there a certain feeling, a psychological feeling of taking and absorbing something, and then you becoming one as that? I guess where we're talking about the utility car, and then there's a certain reflection there. I guess that happens as well. Say if a tradesman comes through your door, you're going to say, "All right, mate, how's it going?" And if you see a very prim and proper old lady come through your door, you're going to be a little bit more like, "Hello there, how'd you do?" So there is a certain amount of reaction to the way we apply ourselves to the world and our perspective and how we absorb things. And I guess everyone's in this biological mix of what we're created in. There can be some major differences. I'd be very interested to find that a few of the things that I come up with really people don't experience that much. I think that'll be very interesting, but I'd be very interested if people do experience this, obviously, as well, or I'll start to think I'm slightly mad. Where can I go with a certain feeling? Now, obviously, I'm mentioning here a lot of these things where you get this feeling of relation. A lot of this stuff is the basis of comedy in itself. Now, if I can get myself to relate to what you feel like, there is a interconnection between us both, and we're like, the world, and especially if I can highlight something that is very negative, that's negative and shit that happens, like a car drives past us on the road and sprays up some muddy shit on us, and we get pissed off for the rest of the day, and you've had the same experience yourself, then we can start chuckling to ourselves in those terms. There's a little bit of there's always a little sad twist I find sometimes with comedy, but it does happen itself in where we teach our children nursery rhymes of Humpty Dumpty jumping off the wall and cracking his head. There's always a certain twist of violence and negativity that happens in the human psyche, which is interesting why that always happens and why it's always mentioned to us through time. Is it really something that it has to be required, or is it something that is inputted into us as a cultural thing? Very interesting and fascinating thing to think about there. Next up. Now, oh my god, I've never been up to such a state where I'm really scraping the barrel in the terms of thoughts of feelings that I've experienced. Many thoughts and experiences that I've had in this time that I can't even describe. But I don't want to start describing thoughts and feelings which are something that are just so obvious that it's going to really not make you happy. This state of scratching for ideas, searching through the mind of blankness, I guess, where there's a stress repulse. The best ideas happen where you're in this state of relaxedness, maybe just coming out of a dream state, and places like that where you find that you're not coming up with an idea, or somebody's giving you a question and you're put on the spot. There's this slow feeling of blankness which plagues your mind and plagues it harder and harder until you get to a point where you're like, I can't think anymore. I'm just crippled with the amount of stress that I have to find in this moment. And maybe that in a sheer stroke of electrical synapses firing brilliance that you get answer to a question. And then literally within the split millisecond of that happening, it comes out at that moment in time. Yet it really does sometimes, and then you're just muted and slowly more and more muted by what has just happened. And then even once the answer's been made, you're still stuck in that perpetual state of thinking why you couldn't think in that moment of time. It's like a stranglehold on yourself. Interesting point. I've been there many times before. I guess I'm not trying to describe the undescribable. I'm trying to describe certain feelings that maybe haven't been expressed before by other people. Maybe that's probably a different approach to applying to these thoughts. I think this might give me a better channel of thinking as well. Maybe describing things that we haven't described before to one another. That might be an interesting point. Let's go with something that we don't really like. Let's say cowardice. I've mentioned this before about cowardice, and I've definitely acted in cowardice, and it is. I always say it's the form of silence, the comfort of the silence of not doing something in that moment of time. So you see something happening that you get this sick feeling in your stomach that you know something as bad has happened, yet you are, and now it's again the same thing as the paralysation of the mind to say the word. There's a paralysation of the body to speak up, to say a word, to question what has gone on through your own fear that the act will be carried out on you yourself. So you are paralysed in a certain state of paralysation that you could be perpetrated with the same ill effect, and that slowly covers your body until you get to a state where you're literally just standing there in the open, just watching, paralysed. It's an awful feeling to be in, yet you really want to act on the bravery. Now, I'll give you another one as well, an act of bravery. Now, I'll try and describe an act of bravery from my perspective and see if in any way, shape or form it relates to you. Now, I find from my perspective, whenever I've had an act of bravery, it's really not been this wise man stroking his beard, having a long thought and knocking on somebody's door and saying, right, I'm having it out with you. An act of bravery I found in my part beforehand is me thinking a lot maybe of that purpose, like many amounts of times, continuously churning over the thought process, or like number and hundreds of times over, and thinking of a number of possible outcomes which can occur from this act, and then sort of getting to myself to a stage of convincing myself, saying, well, you got to do it because the outcome of this will be this, and this. So there's just logical fire steps that you're just crossing your mind into this state of bravery. So you're just saying, well, if this doesn't happen, then this future outcome will happen. So checkmate. You have to do this now. So I get to this point where there's no logical point of which I can continue without doing this bravery act, and the fear takes over. The fear engulfs me to such a debilitating effect that I have the first command in myself, which is to do one thing. If I can do one thing alone, then there will be a string of other possibilities beyond that point, and I'll have to think on my feet beyond that point. So I walk over and then I carry that bravery act. I perform it in a crappy manner and struggle with the consequences and carry on from that point onwards. Usually that's the way I best describe the act of bravery. I don't know whether you experience the same thing as I do. I imagine you may do. Maybe it's a little bit more thought, and I guess I did have a number of thoughtful approaches to it, but really with bravery it's a kind of where an eye, like, you know, where you get a shark that attacks somebody, the eyes, there's this eye layer that covers the eye. It's like a blindness which occurs before you go into that act. I think that's probably the most important thing about bravery, is that you don't really know that you're doing it at the time, because if you really was thinking about consequences of things that potentially could happen to you and dangers that could happen to you, then you wouldn't have acted in that in the first place. Now, when you definitely think about people that have fought wars and run over enemy lines and been ordered to do things, now they really had to act without even thinking, because the general says, if you do not march forward, I will shoot you myself. So they have to march forward against all of their will and possibility, and so therefore the bravery act has to be a point of you dumbing down your own mind, shutting off your own mind, and then just carrying on with that single one command. That is it in a nutshell. Sorry about that. People are really going crazy around here in their way of driving. So there's some thoughts. I hopefully have given you something that you can relate to with that one. I think the description of bravery is quite interesting. If you've got, I guess, a really good, valid bravery argument would be for you to fully understand all the consequences and actions and then carrying it out and knowing a few steps beyond just the one command. But it's an interesting concept, and if anyone hasn't really thought in those terms and phrases, hopefully that could help you out in doing things that you may really be quite fearful of. Anyway, sorry if this podcast has been a little bit choppy in me trying to get some ideas from here and there. I should have really put some show notes together, but I guess that adds to the spontaneism of this one. But yeah, thank you very much if you've got to the end of this podcast and been patient enough to listen to me on these points. If you can provide me with any of your thoughts, I don't really give a damn. Maybe people on trolls on the YouTube or whatever will probably not like what you say, but just say it. I'll be quite interested to hear what you say of a feeling that you may have experienced that you may have, not many people would have described before, or definitely you wouldn't have had it with anybody else. I guess there's a certain level of confession which makes you feel better, which why religions all love this little confession box thing and everything. But yeah, definitely share ideas and thoughts, and we will be coming